Okay. My name is Phyllis Dillon, and I'm pleased to present the next installment of FIT Talks to you. FIT Talks is the oral history program of the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, New York. Today, November 8th, 2016, we are taping in the FIT library on the FIT campus, located at 7th Avenue and 27th Street. Our guest today is Paul Winston. Paul Winston's current firm is Winston Tailors and Chipneck, which is the firm that has descended from a family-owned business known as Chip. The retail store his father and partners established in New York City was, at its peak, one of the great menswear stores in the country, according to fashion historian Patricia Mears and journalist Bruce Boyer. To deepen our understanding of the menswear fashion history of New York City, it's important to document one of the significant men's stores in the New York City retail landscape, just as we document the history of New York City's women's specialty shops and department stores. We are interested in exploring the business model of the Chip firm as much as we are interested in talking about the clothing. The firm is part of the deep style history of mid-century American men's clothing that we now label Ivy style. Such things as tweed jackets, seersucker suits, poplin khaki trousers, soft-shouldered suits, crew-neck sweaters. But when it was new, earlier in its history, it was the it wasn't avant-garde, but it was exciting fashion for men. It was worn by members of America's upper classes and became the aspirational style for most of corporate America in the 50s to the 70s. Just like in the 19th century, when the black suit was considered necessary for any man going into business, in the mid-20th century, the soft-shouldered suit was considered important for a career in corporate America. Because Ivy style was born primarily in New Haven, Connecticut, in a series of custom tailoring shops run by immigrant Jews who made clothing initially for students at Yale and other colleges, I will be asking Paul some questions about that history because the history of Chip is interwoven with those other firms. But first, I'd like to ask Paul some brief biographical questions. Your grandparents were immigrants to the United States. Where did they come from, and when approximately did they come?
Well, my maternal grandparents came from Poland, and my paternal grandparents came from Russia. And we have sort of guesstimated when they were born, which was in the mid-1880s. My grandmother and grandfather from Poland were in the Warsaw Ghetto when they came over. My grandmother was then only 16, and although I knew her very, very well, my grandfather died when my mother was 16, so I never, met him. Although he was a legend back then. He was a kosher butcher, but he was also a majority stockholder of 2 banks. My grandmother was the first licensed woman driver in the state of Connecticut, and she went from a horse and buggy to driving a car. She never went to school anyplace, so she could not read or write in any language. She was a poster child for the difference between education and intelligence, because when my grandfather died, she had 2 daughters to support, so she went down, took over the butcher shop, ran it for the next 65 years, keeping all the books in her head. My paternal grandparents, I knew my maternal grandmother, and she actually was a seamstress who had an alteration business in New Haven when I was growing up, and I can remember as a young child going up to her little place of business. She was divorced from my grandfather, and of course back today, divorce is, doesn't raise anyone's eyebrows, but back then that was considered, something no one ever talked about. And as a result of that, I know absolutely nothing about my grandfather. My father would never talk about him. My uncles would never talk about him. And after my father died, my brother wrote a letter to my uncle and said, gee, now that Dad's gone, can you enlighten us, give us something about your father? And he got the following letter back from him. Some things are left better unsaid. So I know nothing about him other than I know that he was a tailor. And that didn't lead to my father becoming a tailor, but that's what my historical roots are.
Okay, and was there a special reason why they went to New Haven, Connecticut?
I have no idea.
Okay. Were any other of your relatives in the clothing or textile business?
None.
None, okay. So your father, Sidney, was one of the founding partners of CHIP. When was he born and when did he die?
He was born in 1912 and he died in 1983 when he went into the clothing business when he graduated from high school because he couldn't afford, his older brother was in college and they couldn't afford to send my father to college. So he went to work for J. Press and he was a salesman for Press and he went to the different, his job was to go to the prep schools. And it was in that capacity that he met as age contemporaries of his, some people who eventually ended up being, really captains of industry, like the Watsons at IBM and Henry Ford, Cy Vance. And these people, it's very different when you build a relationship when you're both, 17 years old than when you build one at a much, much later point in your life. So these people became lifelong friends of his, and when he ultimately did go in to his own business, these people all, became very, very good customers, and they all remained customers until they died.
Paul, was J. Press the only firm that was doing trunk shows across the country and visiting all the colleges, or were the other tailors in New Haven also doing that?
Well, of course, Brooks Brothers were doing it. Brooks was there before, any of the New Haven tailors except for, I think, probably Finn Feinstein was there even before then. Arthur and Roosevelt went to the different schools. It was Rosenthal and Moretz went to the schools, and back then you were dealing with who were the elite who were going to these prep schools. Today where they have scholarships and they have reached out to have a broad range of people attending these prep schools, but back then the only people who went to those prep schools were the money, mostly, almost exclusively non-Jewish, and they all came from all across the country, and then they all went into the different Ivy League schools, and the New Haven tailors were dealing with those students. And when those students finished school, and then many of them went back from whence they came, be it St. Louis or Denver, the only way that they could continue getting the type clothing that they got was to come back east for it, because there was no one doing that type of clothing anyplace else other than in the east, and that group of tailors were the ones who were serving all of them.
Oh, that's a very concise history, and it explains a lot about it. Did your father, so when you were growing up, did you, what were your ambitions? Were you interested in other careers, or?
I never really gave much of a thought to that. And then when I finished school, it just seemed maybe it was because it was the easiest thing to do. I mean, my father had a business, it was pretty good, and he said, well, yeah, and he wanted me to come into it. So I did, but it's not like I ever really thought of anything else because of that.
Yes. Just before we go into the establishment of CHIP, J Press, when your father worked for it, was a large firm, right? There were
They
many.
were the largest. They had a store in Princeton, they had a store in Cambridge, they had a store in New Haven. The other New Haven tailors were just in New Haven, although later on, many of them, a few of them opened places in New York as well. But New Haven and J Press were sort of the Tigris and Euphrates of what developed into the business, because almost everyone worked for J Press first, and then they often left, much to the dismay of the Press family, particularly Paul Press, who would never talk to anyone after they left him. But all these guys, including the man who was one of my father's partners, Jonas Arnold, and Lou Prager, both, they worked for J Press. The guy who ended up owning Arthur M. Rosenberg worked for J Press. And all of these people would work for Press, and then when they felt like going out on their own, they did. And the Press has always really resented that.
So your father joined J Press right out of high school, and he worked there maybe 10 years or more?
He worked there until the Second World War. And then, to avoid getting drafted, he left J Press and worked in the defense plant, worked at Winchester's, which was in New Haven. And then when the war was over, he then went into the advertising business for a few years, before he then decided that he wanted to go back into the clothing business. And his closest friend was Lou Prager, who was then the manager of the J Press Princeton store, so you can imagine what that did when he left. And they didn't have enough money between the two of them to start CHIP, so they tapped a guy named Jonas Arnold, who was a partner with the Sills brothers, which was another store. And they had a store named CHIP, and then they had a falling out. So Jonas moved up to Cambridge with CHIP, and the Sills brothers then called themselves Sills, and they had the store in New Haven, and then ultimately moved their store into New York. So Jonas gave my dad and Lou the money that they needed to go into business.
And when they started the business, one thing I didn't ask you, how much of the product was custom suits versus ready-made?
There was no ready-made.
No ready-made at this point.
Yeah, when they started, they were just dealing in custom clothing, and everyone who was traveling would wait for Brooks Brothers to post their travel schedule, and then everyone booked in the same hotels on the same date. They'd be on the same floor, and they'd all go around, and of course, Brooks was there by far the longest, and Brooks had the biggest reputation. And I remember when I was learning the business, and I was in Cincinnati, and a man came in, and we were fitting him. When you would go out, you would set up. You had a size range of things, so that when a customer came in, you would establish his size, you would write down measurements and so forth. By then, we had a full retail store by the time I arrived.
Okay.
And the man came in, he looked at stuff, and he put on the jacket, and he said, "My gosh, you've changed your model." We said, "No, we haven't." He said, "It's so much better than it's ever been." I said, "Well, I'm glad you like it." He said, "Oh, it's absolutely terrific. It's so much better, and your choice of cloths are better. Everything about it is absolutely spectacular." I said, "Fine, we'll take the order." And then I said, "And can I have your name, and do you have an account with us?" And he says, "Have an account with you?" He says, "I've had an account with Brooks for years." I said, gee, I'm sorry, but we're not Brooks, we're Press, we'll be glad to open the company. He says, this isn't Brooks? I said, no. He says, oh, then I have to cancel this order. I'm very, very sorry. I won't buy anything except from Brooks. So that shows you the power sometime of the way people can be embedded in a situation like that. Because here, after he had told me how much better it was and how he liked it, everything about it was better, and then when he found out that it was from Brooks, he wouldn't buy it.
But, so that you worked for J. Press also?
Never.
Never. But you're talking about Chip.
I'm talking about Chip
Chip.
when I arrived, which was in 1961.
Okay.
Now, when my dad and Lou started, they were on the second floor at 14 East 44th, and there was a very, very famous watering hole down below them called the Gamecock. And the advertising fraternity would all be in there every day, boozing up. My father always said, I don't know how the hell they do anything. They're all always in there, drunk. But he would go down and drag them upstairs and sell them stuff. And those, ultimately, we bought that building and expanded and had, 5 floors and had a retail store. But that was much, much later. That wasn't until I arrived. But in the 40s, he'd go down, and a lot of their customers were the so-called men in the gray flannel suit, with the advertising guys, who all come into the Gamecock.
Did he also sell shirts, or?
Well, initially, they really did just clothing, and then, of course, coming from New Haven, they were personal friends of the Gants, Marty and Elliot Gant, who owned the Gant Shirt Company, which at that time was just a little business in New Haven. So we carried Gant shirts, which back then, I think they were retailed for, even when I arrived, they retailed for maybe $5, for Gant shirts. And the Gant shirt was, everyone tried to copy the Brooks shirt. I mean, Brooks was the people everyone was trying to follow. They were the first people to have ready-made clothing at the turn of the century. And they had created what came to be the so-called Ivy League, which was a soft construction versus the English, garments, which were stiff and hard, and the classic Brooks Press, called Stewart, Chip garment was a non-darted, so-called sack coat. We all had slight variances to them, but it was a sack coat, and it featured comfort, and it featured usefulness. You could fit stuff into the pockets, which you couldn't in the English, in the English clothing. You could put your wallet in there, you could put a comb in there. No one was carrying cell phones back in those days, obviously. But it became a utilitarian, item, the nature of the jacket. But the real key to it was that it was comfortable, and it led to the easy look that the Ivy League clothing did, and Brooks was, of course, the leader there too, because their button-down shirt with the roll allowed people to see that they didn't have to have a shirt that didn't have wrinkles in it. Everything didn't have to be starched like the IBM shirts were. And the shirts were very big. They were very full-bodied. Now the Gants, and anyone else who was in shirt business, would buy a Brooks Brothers shirt, and they would take it apart. They would trace the parts, and then they would put it back together, and it wasn't the same. No one could get the Brooks roll, no matter what you did. It was like just the way, if you buy any cola drink and you analyze it, it's exactly the same as Coca-Cola, but it doesn't taste the same.
Paul, the roll is in the collar?
Yeah.
It's
Well,
the way it falls?
Well, it's the cutting of the collar and the placement of the buttons, both. But there's more to it, because to this day, although Brooks doesn't make their collar the way they used to, and doesn't make their shirts the way they used to anymore, but when it was that shirt, no one, no matter how many times they tried and took it apart and put it together, it didn't come out the same. It was some magic part of it, just like the secret formula of Coca-Cola.
I thought it might be useful for you to go over some of the other characteristics of this relaxed suit? You know, what does 3/2 mean?
Well, it was a 3-button coat, but it was really a 2-button coat. Because you only buttoned the two lower, the middle button, you didn't lower the lower button. The upper button was up in the lapel here, you didn't even see it, and that's because you had a long roll. Now you could have a short roll like this, and then you would have, the button would show. And that's, the difference in the roll is created by,
1 second, the microphone.
Yeah, do not touch it. Do not touch it.
Oh, don't touch it.
oh, okay, yeah.
Sorry.
And the roll is created by the size of the top collar, not by pressing. Because through the years, people would come in and say, gee, can you help me with this? I bought this, and it has a short roll. Can you make it a long roll? My dry cleaner pressed it, he couldn't. They said, no one can press it, but that's not what makes the difference in the collar. But there was a model back then. You didn't ask people what they wanted, because with very, very few exceptions, everyone had cuffs, no one had pleats, you had 2 buttons on your sleeve, you had 3 buttons in the front, you didn't have a dart in the front, but each of the different, for example, our garment was more fitted than the press garment or the Brooks garment, because we had side body fitting, not a dart in the front. And everyone had their little bit of what they were doing that was slightly different. But that was the suit that everyone bought. Almost everyone. There were always people who wanted variations, or some people came in and wanted rope shoulders, which the natural shoulder didn't have. That was the other thing that was, of course,
Well, what
very,
is a
very
rope
part of
shoulder?
it. A rope shoulder rolls up like that.
I see.
That's what the English suits, a lot of English suits have. They're square shoulder, where the Ivy League jacket had no padding in it. It followed your natural shoulders. And if you had one shoulder lower than another, where in other modes of clothing they would doctor that by putting more padding or less padding. But what we would do was cut the garment to accommodate for that. And that was the key jacket that the Ivy League clothing became. It was comfortable, it was natural, it was full body, it was more full body. All of our shirts were more full body. Today people don't want full body shirts.
So, Chip, when your father ran the business, who was responsible for for ordering the fabrics? Chip had a reputation of more colorful corduroy pants, more choice, a little more adventure in the fabrics. Was that your father?
You see, Chip had something that no one else had. They had my father. And he was an innovator. He created things. He created patch mattress. He was the first person to take tartans, where people in Scotland only wore tartans in kilts or in trews. He made tartan jackets. He made tartan cummerbunds. He made things of that nature. And he was adventurous, and he had really an amazing taste, because he loved clothing, which is something that I've said many times is not a particular love of mine. My love of the business is dealing with the people that I've been privileged to deal with. But he was tremendous in clothing, and he had a great color sense, and his customers appreciated that, or else they wouldn't have been dealing with us. So that's why even some of the most conservative people, like Tom Watson, would wear the wildest things you've ever imagined in his, not business attire, way out stuff. And all of our customers wore that stuff way out. And we became very well known for that, more so than other people. We were the first people to do embroidered things on trousers and on jackets.
Did your father travel in Europe to find these things, or did he just do it by sourcing from?
Well, the answer is he didn't have to travel to find them. He created what he wanted. He didn't find it someplace else. And then he would go and have people do what he wanted them to do. But he did travel. Two of his very, very closest friends was Norman Hilton of the Norman Hilton Clothing Company. And they would go over to, and Dick Carroll, who owned Carroll and Company out in the West Coast. Dick Carroll was a theatrical agent, didn't know anything about the clothing business. My father taught him everything. He came and he said, hey, look, I want to go in the clothing business. I said, okay, Dick, here's what you have to do. Set him up. And the three of them would go over to Europe every year for 3 weeks until my dad died. But again, they really didn't have to source anything. There was everyone was dealing with the same sources of supply. There were mills in Scotland, and you knew who they were. And there were the makers in England and in Huddersfield, you knew who they were. Now, they didn't create things for my father. My father created stuff for them. He said, why don't you do this, why don't you do that? And sometimes they would come over here, and I would sit with them, and I'd show them. He would color things, he would change things, and I'd show him. He said, no, that's not what, you have to change this here, you have to move that there. He was absolutely, tremendous at that kind of stuff. And his customers really enjoyed the kind of things he was creating. And while many of them were chairman of the boards of the most important companies in the world, but they went for this wild stuff for their spare time.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that when you joined the company, that it had 30 shades of corduroy or...
Yeah, we had, corduroy in almost every color you could imagine, which we had as ready-made. By then, when I arrived, of course, we had become a ready-made store before I arrived. They did nothing but custom clothing for a number of years, and then they started to expand, adding shirts, adding sweaters, which is always one of my favorite stories, because we got our sweaters from a guy who had his office right next door to us, E.S. Deans. The name of his company was Deans of Scotland. And when you looked at the label, in little teeny weeny print, it said, made in Hong Kong. Big label said, Deans of Scotland. Little print said, made in Hong Kong. And it's not that the fact that something is made in Hong Kong or China doesn't mean it has to be bad. I mean, there's lousy stuff made every place, and there's good stuff made every place too. And his sweaters were great, And we carried, I don't know how many colors in Shetland sweaters, and because that stuff was what the Ivy League people wore in their spare time.
Yeah, Bruce Boyer said, I think that he had a lemon yellow or...
Oh, we had lemon yellow, we had bright pink, we had, way out colors, not just fringe colors.
Right. So, and what was some of the brands, the ready-made brands that you carried? Any?
Well, initially we carried nothing but Norman Hilton. And then when my father wanted, and in the summer, we carried Haskell, because the Haskell family were friends of my dad's. And then when my dad wanted to offer a lower price garment than the Hilton garment, he had them made by Lynette. And Lynette and Nick originally made nothing but dinner clothing. And the two owners of Lynette, or the one owner, was Paul Lynette, was basically an attorney who was a really, really good businessman, but cared even less about the clothing, the clothing and the clothing business than I do. And he hired a guy named Seymour Landsman, and who ran the business for him, and who, with my father's assistance, enlarged their business tremendously and branched out from dinner clothing to making, suits and jackets and blazers and so forth. So they were our source for our lower made product. Those were the only two people we ever used. We got, Burberry raincoats and Invitaire raincoats, and our outerwear was made up in Boston. Overcoats. Back then, men wore overcoats. Today, if you go to a street corner, if 100 men walk by, 95 of them are wearing ski jackets. And that's what I have on. They don't wear overcoats anymore. I can't remember the last time anyone asked us to make an overcoat. And I've been in business now for 50 years.
So, when did you join?
I joined in I started in 1960, but then I had another year of school, and then I was there full-time in 61.
And was the store still at 14 East 40?
Yeah, but we were just on the second floor. We had the second and third floor. Then we bought the building, and because Jack Stutz, who was the owner, who was the very, very colorful owner of the Gamecock, had sold his restaurant. Someone else was running it, and then of course we bought the building and had to move them out. And then we expanded, went down, had the ground floor, and also went up, had all the floors of the building.
Uh-huh, so you had street presence,
Oh yeah, we had street
and
presence
you had
there.
windows.
Yes, and we had windows, and we had a full range of ready-made everything. We then carried, in addition to the Gant shirts, we also added Troy Guild shirts as a higher range. We carried, Allen Solly knitwear, and we carried, back then people wore sized hose. You didn't wear, one size fits all kind of things. We had Coxmore. We had a full range of very good stuff, as did Brooks Brothers, and as did Press, and as did Paul Stewart. And in many cases, we were dealing with the same sources of supply.
So people could have learned about it simply by walking down 44th Street.
Oh, absolutely. And it was with some frequency, depending on whether a person came from Madison Avenue or Fifth Avenue, that they ended up walking into the wrong store, because ultimately Press moved down next to us. Originally when I was there, Press was not next to us. They were on the corner of Madison on the second floor. Then they moved into the building next to our building. So now if someone was coming by, the two stores were literally right, next door to each other.
So was this a friendly competition? Were people loyal to just one place?
Many of the customers were loyal to one or the other, and many of the customers went to both. It could have been a friendly competition, except that the presses wouldn't talk to him, wouldn't say hello to anybody. I speak to Richard Press. I consider Richard a friend. He comes in, and Richard will talk to my father. But the presses wouldn't talk to anybody, including not just us, but everyone else who left them also. The New Haven group, when you go back from long before I was here, but when the New Haven tailors started, and even when my dad opened our place in New York, we still lived in New Haven. He commuted to New York every day, as did all the others. And it was almost like, a club. Everyone was members of the same country club. We all knew each other very well. I, of course, was a kid at the beginning. And I can remember how really uncomfortable it was for me when I got older and started working, and when these people who I had always called, Mr. Moretz, Mr. Rosenthal, and so forth, said, please, you can't call me that anymore, you have to call me Mo. I said, I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to do it. And close friends of my, family friends even, who were sort of, they called them courtesy aunts and uncles, but although they weren't really family. And then, you knew them from when you could walk, and then when you got to be 25 years old, they said, please, call me Selma, call me this. But I could never do that. It was uncomfortable doing that. But all the New Haven tailors knew each other very, very well, and they all got along with each other, except the presses.
So, what did you especially like about the business? I mean, did you?
Well, I loved working with my father, because he was so good at what he did. But I really I'm a people person, and we had the most exciting customers in the world coming in. And to think that at the age of 21, I was with President Kennedy, and he he was saying, Paul, I want you to pick one out for me. I mean, how can you beat that? And we had, you know, the chairman of the biggest and most important companies in the world. If I had at that time bought $1,000 of each of their stock, I'd have millions and millions of dollars today, which I didn't. You know, that just shows how smart I was. Yeah.
So, when did the firm move out of 14 East 44th Street?
Well, we bought the building. My dad died in '83. My brother and I were running it. In '86, just before the bubble burst in Japan, a Japanese gentleman walked in and he said, I have a client who wants to buy your building. I said, this building's not for sale. He said, yes, but my client wants to pay you X for it. And I said, well, you just bought a building. And we went out and sold it. We went out of the retail business, which I'm glad I'm not in today. I don't consider myself to be.
So would you, the sort of the scope of the business, what was the high point or the point at which everyone was wearing this clothing?
Well, that was in the 60s, and into the beginning of the 70s. And then small specialty stores started opening up across the country. So that's when we stopped traveling. And then we would travel only to Chicago because we had a huge following in Chicago. Brooks Brothers started opening stores all across the country, and small, well-run specialty stores dealing in the Ivy League type clothing opened up across the country. So it was no longer a raison d'etre for a customer out in St. Louis to have to come to New York or to wait for us to come out there when we'd only be out there 2 days a month. Maybe he was busy those days, and if he needed something, what was he going to do? So we stopped traveling out there then. I started the tie company in the middle of the 60s, which is a separate company from the clothing company, and that, of course, today the tail wags the dog, because my tie company today is more important than the clothing company. And the tie company has a worth. My clothing company really is not worth anything, because the people, if someone came in and said they'd give me whatever for it, they'd be wasting their money, because my customers are dealing with me, they're not dealing with the name of the company. Where my little tie company, which is fun, really has a worth because of the designs I created.
Yeah, why don't you describe the tie company?
Well, number one, we make them ourselves, and we make them very, very well, and we knock the heck out of anyone else's prices. And although the overwhelming majority of people aren't wearing ties today, those who are a niche market and they care. And I'm making 16 colors in Italian grenadine ties. We're all getting our grenadine, anyone who's selling grenadine ties, we're all getting the same cloth. There are only 2 mills that make the cloth. Everyone's selling for over $100, I'm selling for 55. I'm still making ancient madder ties. I get the same silk from the same mill that Drake's and Ben Silver do. They sell them for $165. I sell them for $67.50. But the fun of the business is the only thing that I can do as well or better than my father is I can make up really stupid, funny ties. And we have ties which are very, very edgy. And people have to be careful when they're wearing them, because a lot of them have messages, and the messages are edgy, and they represent what I describe as sophisticated humor. And there are others who say, well, that's bad taste. They say, well, if that's bad taste, you don't have buy it. But those exact same ties, if you put them on the counter in Nordstrom's, in fact, would be in bad taste. But when my definition of the difference is sophisticated humor is who and where. So when you take a tie like, I have a tie that has all different men's heads on it, and sitting on each man's head, there's a cat, stretching or standing or sitting. And that's a tie for a man who has nothing on his mind but pussy. Now, when I showed that tie to Tom Watson, who had had a heart attack the year before and was still walking with a cane, and he started laughing so hard that I was afraid he was going to have another heart attack. And when he stopped laughing and caught his breath, he said, "That's the funniest tie I've ever seen in my life. I don't know who I'm going to give them to, but I want you to gift box 2 dozen of them and send it to my office." Now, when Tom Watson gave that to someone, that was sophisticated humor. And I have other ties that are of that ilk. They're even more ragey.
So you have a little office now. Why don't you tell us the address?
Well, we are now at 20, our building actually has entrances on both 44th Street and 43rd Street. We're in the lobby. It's between 5th and 6th, so if you're coming in on 44th, the address is 28 West 44th. And if you're coming in on 43rd, the address is 25 West. And just to show that we haven't strayed far from the Ivy League, next door to us on 44th Street is the Penn Club, across the street is the Harvard Club, and on 43rd Street we're next door to the Princeton Club. So we still get to see the sons of some of our customers. Of course, you know, the original core people who my father had brought in, are with amazingly few exceptions, are now with my father on the other side of the past. And my contemporaries are even out of wearing clothing, you know, to suits anymore. You know, and a lot of people, my friends, were still working at my age.
But you occasionally have customers for a custom suit or made to measure?
Well, we do both. But our made to measure suit is really is more sophisticated than most. I'm not going to say we're the only ones who do it this way, but we still individually draft a pattern and we individually cut them ourselves by hand. The man who cuts them. Most people in the made to measure business are using block patterns, and they're doing variations on block patterns, and they're being cut by robots or by machine cutting.
Yeah.
And we still do that. And
Are they sewn in New York?
yes, I sort of made up my mind that I wasn't going to pursue business anymore. I was going to let the clothing business just fade out. Because when my cutter, who's 87 years old, hangs up his shears, I'm going to stop doing it because I can't get anyone else who can do that.
And what is his name?
His name is Jerry Susi, and so I told him, I said, "Hey Jerry, I'm just not going to pursue that business anymore." And as soon as I made that decision, people started walking in and ordering stuff. I wasn't calling them, and I don't call people anymore. They call and say, "Gee, I want to do something." I say, "Oh, okay, you can come in," especially if it's someone who we have the patterns for already. They say, "Yeah, you can come in, we'll do it." But I do tell all of them the handwriting's on the wall.
Did he work for Chip, Jerry Susi?
No, he started working for me about maybe 20 years ago, which we're no longer Chip, and
Yes.
we're Winston Taylor.
But Oscar, who was the alteration tailor
Right,
in your space, did he work for Chip?
indirectly.
Okay.
Oscar worked for a company called 6th Avenue Alterations. And when we, back in the 60s, ran a sale, unlike the ridiculous promotions that are going on today, which aren't real sales, when we ran a sale back then, it was a sale. And Brooks Brothers, Paul Stewart, J. Press, Saks Fifth Avenue, ourselves, we all ran sales twice a year. It was the first day we were open after the 4th of July and the first day we were open after New Year's. And they were called clearance sales because you didn't bring anything in for the sale. You sold stuff that was left on the racks to make room to bring the next season's stuff in. We had 20 tailors working for us then. And we would sell so much at the sale that we couldn't handle it with our 20 tailors. So our overflow we would give to Oscar at 6th Avenue Tailoring. And so I've known him for 50 years. When we moved to the 5th floor at 11 East, and we were there for, more than 10, 12 years or so, and each year I would have a 3-year lease, a 3-year lease. When my last lease was going to be up, I went and said, well, you're going to give me another lease? And of course we're going to give you another lease. And that was in January. The lease was up in June. Each month I would say, gee, you haven't sent me the lease, you haven't sent me the lease. June came, and I said, where's the lease? We can't give you a lease. I said, well, why didn't you tell me in January? They said, well, we thought we were going to be able to. I was alone on the floor for a year. Everyone else had moved off. And they were trying to rent the other spaces, and I was in the middle. And they said, well, if we can't give you the long one, because if someone wants to rent the space to your left or right and needs, your space, we're going to have to ask you to leave. So they said, you can stay month to month. I said, well, I'll stay month to month, but you have to agree to give me 3 months' notice if you're going to ask me to leave. And they said, yeah, that's fine. 6 months went by. And then they came to me and they said, we haven't rented anything. We don't have any tenants. But we're giving you 3 months' notice because we're just going to knock the floor down. We think we're going to be able to more easily rent it if it's knocked down because the 2 spaces that were there were not well laid out. So I said, well, okay, fine. And then I said, I'm going to close the clothing business down because I can operate my tie company from any place. So I went over to say goodbye to Oscar. And I said, and he was in the building where we now are and where I had been getting a haircut for 50 years. And I said, Oscar, I'm closing it down. He said, why? I said, well, they won't renew my lease. He said, 3 or 4 really very, very prestigious, well-known custom tailors uptown have invited me to move in with them, but they're further away from the bus. I said, I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to close it. He said, don't close it, move in with me. So I said, well, you're closer to the bus. So I moved in with him and I've now been there for 10 years. Now I did stop because that's his business doing alterations, because when we were on the 5th floor at 11, we did alterations for people, then we did alterations for press. And when Brooks would have someone who would come in and need an alteration done the same day, because they do all their alterations out on Long Island, they would send them to us. So we had an alteration business as well as the clothing business and the tie business. But I now no longer do that because that's Oscar's business, and I will only do alterations on stuff that we've made. Or, for one of our own really good customers who asked me to come in and do it, I'll do them. But my agreement with Oscar is that you do all the alterations, I'm not going to do any alterations.
Yes. So do any of your old customers come by and see you?
Yeah, because I've always enjoyed just talking to them. They don't come by sometimes to buy, sometimes they come by just to talk, to find out what's going on. Because that's my pleasure in the business.
Yeah. Well, this has been a wonderful session. I think we've learned a tremendous amount, and I want to thank you very, very much.
Well, it's been my pleasure. And,
is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, not unless you have a leading question. Yeah.
No, I think that's fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now one of these days my grandchildren will be able to come and see it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.